Welcome back, everybody, to this panel on project finance. I have the pleasure of introducing a very distinguished group of speakers. I will do so in a moment. And before, I would like to introduce briefly the topic. You may have realized throughout the whole morning there was a lot of mentioning about the importance of the financial sector when it comes to implementing the business and human rights agenda. And maybe some of you may have asked themselves why. Why is there so much emphasis on the financial sector? And I hope we will provide some of the answers to you in this session this afternoon. What I would like to highlight is in the OECD context, we have this system of national contact points, and we have seen a very sharp increase in cases being filed before these national contact points that concern the financial sector. So it's about 20% of the cases that we have at the moment that are related to the financial sector, which tells you something that obviously this sector is highly relevant. We also spoke briefly about this morning in several sessions how important it is to translate the standards that we have into manageable guidelines, and giving guidance also to middle management, for example, so that they know how to implement the standards on the ground in their daily business operations. And for this purpose, the OECD has at a very early stage started to engage with the financial sector. And so far, we issued one guidance on institutional investors. There is another one in progress. It will probably be released in fall this year. And a third one is being prepared on project finance, or it's in the making, I should say, the plan at least, that work will start probably next year. So there's a lot of work going on, institutional investment already done, corporate finance in the making, and project finance on the horizon, so to speak. And with this being said, I would like to start our panel. I would like to begin with Patrick Bader. Patrick is currently the head of corporate social responsibility team. It's in the division of, in the corporate and institutional banking division of BNP Paribas. And he created that division actually in 2009. He also serves in various groups dealing with banks and human rights, corporate social responsibility. That includes one of the OECD expert groups on responsible business conduct for financial institutions. So he has been and is involved in the development of this new instrument. He also serves as a steering committee member of the Equator Principles. Now, Patrick, you have a lot of experience when it comes to project financing. And first of all, I would like to ask you the question, can you tell us what project financing really is? It's a very technical term.
Okay, Christine, so thank you, everybody. I'm very glad to be here, and I hope we'll have a lot of time for questions. Yes, it's a right question, because before starting sustainability within BNP Paribas, I was in project finance for many, many years. Basically, project finance is a particular way of lending where it's usually applied to an asset or a couple of assets, where basically the repayment that banks get, if things go well, are based on the cash flow generated by that project. Unlike a corporate lending, where you have a company with various activities, I would say maybe around the world or on multiple sites, and you don't know exactly where the funds are coming from. In project finance, it's very specific, it's tied to the asset, so basically it involves a much larger due diligence.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that very concise definition and explanation. It seems to me then, as a bank, you know exactly what you get yourself into. If you're doing project finance, you know exactly, or should know, what the funds are being used to. So I would really like to ask then the question, in what ways then do project finance activities provide opportunities to apply leverage? Is it really that simple?
It can be considered because, as I explained, project finance is really geared or limited to a defined number of assets. In most cases, one asset. It could be a refinery, a power plant, etc. And therefore, it's really a way of lending where you do a very detailed due diligence on all aspects: economic, financial, technical, environmental, and social. On the environmental and social, I think, let's be fair, banks really started to pay a lot of importance with the makeup of the Equator Principle. The first version was announced in 2003, where banks really realized that we had been lending without taking enough care of the environmental and social aspect in certain developing countries, and that's why banks got together to come up with the Equator Principle, which is a procedure basically governing how you approach environmental and social, how do you assess environmental and social risk for projects. So again, project finance is really characterized by a lot of due diligence. You define the rule of the game with the owners of the project. It's a very detailed documentation, and the role of each party is clearly defined. So in that sense, banks can have some leverage, first to define the rule of the game, so to ensure that appropriate, for example, standard will be applied, and also because the document is very detailed, so in case there is a breach on the documentation, on one of the conditions in the various contracts, banks have the ability to exercise, I think, leverage to try to remedy the situation with the clients, which is different from corporate lending, where the financing agreement is very minimal, very large, not specific. So in that sense, yes, project finance provides additional leverage.
Thank you very much. Now, you mentioned the Equator Principles. Now, my question would really be, I mean, do these due diligence processes that you apply right now, are they any different from what is recommended by the OECD guidelines? You've been a member of these expert groups, so I suppose you know.
Yes, I think it is different in a sense that, as I said, project finance, it's really specific to the asset. You have a clearer view on the asset, whereas for corporate lending, you have no clue exactly what your client is doing with the money that you are entrusting your client. You hope to be repaid eventually. And that's why it is different. And really, what I would say, what is really striking for corporate lending, and people should be really aware of, is that banks, in a project lending situation, you have more leverage at the beginning when you basically structure the financing with your client. Whereas, for example, the general guideline of the OECD recommend a continuous process. Really, for corporate lending, you do most of the work initially, and when it's signed, it is signed, and after that, the banks have less leverage, maybe more in project finance, where you have more covenants, so more opportunities for banks to monitor the situation. And again, we have to be also very specific, is that banks do not manage the operation of their clients. So it's something really I want to make it very clear, because sometimes there's confusion. People believe that banks are in control. No, when we, especially in corporate lending, when we lend, we can check a few aspects before signing, and after that, it's really our clients who are running their own operation. Hopefully, with the guidance we are working on with the OECD, it will be a bit more detailed. It will incentivize banks to pay more attention, which I think it's very good. But one of the characteristics is basically we have, among the banking world so far, a lack of consistent approach between banks. Each bank has developed its own setup for corporate lending, various types of corporate lending in various sectors, etc. I think there is a need to unify that, and that the guiding, the guidelines that are going to be produced by the OECD are going to be extremely helpful to raise the bar, to also provide realistic expectation to general stakeholders of banks, of what banks can achieve in corporate lending and not, what banks should do. And again, it's difficult for banks to progress alone. Certain banks have advanced more than other banks. And I think with these guidelines, we will be able to raise the bar in the industry. I'm being very optimistic, as you know.
Very good. I'm a notorious optimist also, so welcome to the club. I take two key messages. I mean, you're saying it's very important to have a harmonized approach among all banks, and I also hear you loud and clearly that applying due diligence before you conclude the deal is really absolutely crucial. Now, let me turn with these two messages to our other bank representative on the panel, who is Guylaine Nadeau. She's the Asia-Pacific Head of Sustainability for ABN AMRO, and she's based in Singapore. Ghislaine, if I ask you, and we heard of, obviously banks are following different approaches, how do you in ABN AMRO, how do you ensure that you finance responsible projects?
Thank you very much, Christine, and I'm very happy to be here and share our experience on how do we implement the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles. ABN AMRO is a Dutch bank. We are active in retail, commercial banking and corporate and institutional banking. And I work for the corporate and institutional banking activities in APAC. Means that we finance the energy, commodities and transportation sector. As a bank, we have about 5 million clients, individuals that bank with us. We have 10,000 of employers that work for us, directly, indirectly. We have millions of people who work for our clients and companies in our investment universe. And of course, then a lot of people who are in communities around our clients and companies that we finance. So banking is about people. We have a lot of impact on human rights, potentially. So we have a role as an employer, a service provider, an investment service provider, and a lender. And I would like to focus indeed on our lending activities. So how do we make sure that our lending activities are responsible? We have, well, first of all, by responsible finance, that means that we apply our sustainability risk policies to all our lending activities at client onboarding and each time when we have a new lending opportunity, when we conclude a new transaction. We have operational sustainability risk policies, so policy for our lending and project finance activities. The project finance policy is aligned with the Equator Principle requirements, but we also have thematic policies, and that's our human rights statement. Then we have sector requirements for the so-called high-risk sector from a sustainability perspective. The risk level is determined by the sector, the location, and stakeholder attention. And these sector requirements include specific requirements on human rights, aligned with the UN guiding principles. So companies that we finance, they should have a human rights policy statement. They should ensure providing working conditions that are in line with the ILO core conventions within their own activities, but also in the supply chain. They should have a system in place on supplier screening, and there should be a communication and grievance mechanism. So we do that due diligence, including our human rights due diligence at client acceptance and lending. We have an inclusive approach, what means comply or improve, not exclude. If we see that there's not a full compliance with our policies, we engage with the company. The engagement is not forever. Maximum engagement period of time would be 3 years, but it depends case by case. We define an action plan with the company with clear KPIs, and we monitor that. And after, there will be an evaluation moment after our engagement, which will lead to exit of the relationship in the worst case. That means that we don't have any leverage to improve. There's no willingness from the client to improve. But of course, that is not the best option because we would like to stay involved. Continue of the engagement, that's also an option, or the company complies with our policies and we can just proceed with our relationship. Also important to mention is that it is, our due diligence is ongoing, so every year our high-risk clients will be reviewed. Every new transaction we will do again the due diligence, and there will be an event-driven review in case there is an issue. So responsible finance, that's the first part. Then we have sustainable finance. That's more we can go, then I refer to sustainable finance instruments. Maybe you've heard about the ESG incentive loans, environmental social governance incentive loans. We agree with the company on KPIs to improve the environmental and social performance, including human rights, often linked to the SDGs that the company wants to focus on. If there's a progress on the KPIs, if the KPIs are met after, for example, 1 year, we will give a discount. If they're not met, there will be a premium. That's an example of sustainable finance. We also have an impact banking product. That means that we, together with a client, for example, in the palm oil sector, we will do a farmer finance project focusing on the improvement of the livelihood of the farmers, but also improving best practices, farmer practices. So in that way, we can also contribute to the SDG together with our clients. A third form of responsible business and finance is the sector approach. The Dutch banks work together in the Dutch banking agreement, focusing on due diligence, aligning our methodologies to do our due diligence specific on human rights. So we have done a sector mapping of the cacao sector, the palm oil sector. The entire value chain is mapped. Where are the human rights risks? How are we involved? And what players are active in the sector? And how can we work together on solutions? Because I think as a financial institution, it's key to work together with all kind of different stakeholders. And that means our clients, but also NGOs, labor unions, and so on. So that's, and I think the SDGs are a very powerful tool. We see that, and I'm based now here in APAC, the SDGs, a lot of companies have endorsed the SDGs, are focusing on the SDGs, have prioritized the SDGs where they can have impact. So it gives us, it is a connector and a start of our conversation on if there are opportunities to improve.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a lot of standards. You mentioned the UNGPs, you mentioned the OECD guidelines, you mentioned the Dutch banking sector agreement. You also mentioned the SDGs as a connector. I'm just wondering how do you define the relationship between these different standards? Also in internal communication, I would imagine that's quite challenging also with clients.
Yeah, that's correct. Oh, sorry. I think the SDGs gives a good starting point, and we refer to our own requirements, and they refer to all the guidelines you have mentioned, but it's not always that necessary to point that out. I think it's important to underline that environmental and social impacts have to be managed in a proper way, and that is sustainability risk is an integrated risk. If you don't manage it properly, it can lead to a financial risk, operational risk, legal risk for the company, but also for us as a financier, let alone the reputational risk.
So if I understand you correctly, you do some sort of a translation, consolidation of these standards within your own policy.
Yeah, that's correct.
Very good. Now that we've heard so much from the two banks, I'm turning to Namit Agarwal. Namit is on the steering committee of Fair Finance Asia. This program is a program that aims at influencing the financial sector in Asia to become more transparent and responsible. And the program is currently being implemented in several countries, in Indonesia, in Japan, in Thailand, India, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Vietnam, so a very broad scope. Namit also works for Oxfam in India. Now, Namit, if you listen to our two colleagues from the banks, it seems they're doing a lot. Are they doing enough?
Thanks, Christine. I will be talking about the experience that we have had in the Asia region, hearing from the perspectives of some of our coalition members in the countries that you just mentioned. And if I may slightly tweak the question about are the banks doing enough, or are there enough banks doing enough? Because I think that's where the challenge lies. Unless we have enough banks signing up to Equator Principles or signing up to some of these guidelines, it's really difficult to create that level playing field. And I think that's where the challenge is. Out of the 97 Equator Principles signatories, there are only 14 from Asia. And that's a really small number compared to the size of assets and lending that's being handled in the region. And I think that is really significant, an indicator that needs to change to be able to bring about any systemic change. And the challenge really is that if there are very few banks who are adhering to these kind of principles, then there is a lack of level playing field. And in a competitive market, unless there are good number of banks who are demanding a level of disclosure, some sort of policies and monitoring, it's going to be very difficult to bring about any behavior change or practice change in those companies. What's also lacking is there is not enough recognition from the regulators, the banking regulators, in terms of acknowledging that if there are certain banks asking for certain level of policy commitments or practice disclosures, the regulators are not acknowledging or strengthening those. Unless, I mean, those things sort of come together, just a handful of banks asking for these disclosures will not be enough. So I think that's where the problem lies.
So the main challenge is a lack of regulation then, in essence.
So regulations is one part of it. There might be also cases where several banks come together voluntarily and demand something. So it's really about having that level playing field, whether it's regulation driven or like my colleague just mentioned about the Dutch banks coming together and creating some sort of a coherence in what Dutch banks are demanding. Unless there is that level of coherence, it's really difficult to change anything systematically. We have heard from some banks that we have engaged with that, if they go out in the market and looking for projects to invest in, if there are other banks who are, willing to finance at a competitive rate without any due diligence, there is very difficult for some of these banks who are signatories to kind of say that, no, unless you fulfill certain obligations and requirements, we will not be lending to you. Because the companies have that power to kind of say that, okay, we will go to some other bank. And in that sort of a scenario, the influence of the sustainability people within the banks is very, very limited. Then it turns out to be, in a way, just risk mitigating and making sure that you have done your impact assessments, both environment and social, just to justify your own commitments. But the decisions being taken by the lending committee or the management is already there. I mean, you have to survive in that competitive market. So get an impact assessment that meets some level of requirements and commitments and just stays at that. How do we, like Patrick mentioned, how do we make sure that everybody is following the same rules of the game? How do we make sure that we raise the bar so that companies who are not following some of these guidelines do not get access to finance without those commitments? I think that's the kind of imbalance that we see, at least in this region at this point.
Thank you. I think Patrick wants to come in.
Yes, I'm very glad to hear what Namit said because I could not agree more with that. It's true that we are a very large industry. You have tons of banks, and you have certain banks that are trying to progress, and it's extremely difficult when you have your competitors, as you said, that come and basically provide the same financing with no conditions. So sometimes it's quite difficult, and we've been in cases where we had to refuse certain financings because they were not meeting our criteria according to our policies. And I think I wanted also to rebound about the need for regulation to recognize. I think the holy grail, I would say, for us in sustainable finance would be able to, the same way we have our model, our financial model, which are reviewed by our regulators, that are allowing us to calculate the capital we have to put in front of the financing. This is currently based only on financing consideration. If tomorrow we are able to convince the regulator that our model correctly allows us to determine the clients that perform well from an environmental and social perspective, we could have a discount on the rate of capital. What it means for us, it means that we can lend more to this client and we can lend at a cheaper rate. So this is what could be achieved to really give a boost to sustainable lending. I think because at the moment, yes, we are all doing the sustainability index loan, but we are doing it, I would say, based on our margin. If tomorrow we are able to account for the calculation of our risk and satisfy regulators that we are doing it correctly and that we can get a discount in terms of capital requirement, it will allow us to do more to favor the best performing client as well, so giving an incentive to our clients to perform well. And the last point I wanted to make, also rebounding on what Namit mentioned, is that I think it's also in the interest of our client, because at the moment, currently in the market, if you move out of project finance, where the approach is quite standardized among banks. For a corporate loan, BNP will come with, I don't know, BNP Paribas will come with a few questions, ABN with different questions, probably. Some of them are the same, some of them are not, and our clients are lost, and it's not very efficient. So it is in our interest to have similar methodology. And what we always say is that in terms of environmental and social risk management, we are not really competing because if we want to raise the playing field, we are competing to develop new products. But in terms of risk management, I think it is really in our interest to have a similar approach between banks and our client as well.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we've heard that call to the regulator, obviously, for leveling the playing field. We've also heard that it's in the interest of banks. Now the question is, how do we get that done? How do we get the regulator taking action? And in an ideal world, the regulator would respond to societal needs, right? If we have a demand in society, if we have expectations on banks, we would expect the regulator to react. So I'm turning to John Birch. John is currently the manager of the Secretariat of the Australian National Contact Point. That contact point is located within the Treasury in Canberra. Now, John, you are obviously in your function for the Australian NCP, you are faced with societal expectations because quite often we see cases being filed as an expression that there is an expectation in society. And I would like to ask you the question, would you confirm that there is an increase with respect to considering societal or environmental impacts by banks?
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I have to say yes. We're seeing more activity in this area. I don't think it's something that banks can avoid. We've got a case that I'm going to cover today. Would you like me to talk about that now or come back to that?
Maybe if you can say something, what are indicators that you see these expectations being raised?
Oh, yeah, good question. I mean, we're getting more, I guess we've got a very active civil society sector in Australia, and they're raising these things. But I don't know, I think there's been a bit of a shift in the Australian context. The banks more recently have come under a lot of pressure. There's been a Royal Commission on Banking in our country, and I think that's perhaps been a bit of a wake-up call for the finance sector players, and I think you're seeing a lot of them coming out in public forums saying that they care about this stuff now. So I sense there's been a shift. Whether that shift in terms of their public pronouncements actually turns into a shift in their behaviour is yet to be determined. So it's a bit of a watch this space thing, I think, properly.
So a significant loss of trust in the financial sector, I think we're safe to say that, documented by that report. And then you have recently really been faced with a case, you dealt with a case that involved the responsibility of a bank vis-à-vis a client that it was providing finance to. It was a very important case, and maybe I think it would be very interesting for the audience if you could give us more details, how it came about, what happened during the handling of that case, as far as you can, of course, disclose the details.
Yeah, and I'd say that with this one, even though we've made a public report, and probably some of the people in this room have seen that, I'm a bit of an optimist. I'm in the optimist camp. I'm still hoping that there's something that we can do as an NCP to get a good outcome here. So I'm reluctant to call it finished and finalised because I still think there's an opportunity for us to do some more work.
Can you maybe just tell what the case was all about?
Sure.
Because most people will not have the facts in front of them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting that the topic of this thing is about project finance, and that was initially, this is one of our longest running cases. Initially, it actually happened before I started working, and I've been in this area for more than 3 years now. And when in looking at some of the early paperwork around it, there was quite a debate going on about, is this project finance as a general? As it turned out, it didn't really matter because the bank in question got back to us and said, we don't care whether it's project finance or general finance. We have a set of principles that we want to put up there to guide our lending decisions, our corporate behaviour, and so they didn't really want to make the distinction between the two. But look, it was interesting. as a case because they made some changes to their...
Can you just maybe say who brought the complaint in the first place?
Yeah, well, it was by some representatives of some people who'd been displaced. So the background to the case is that our Australian bank was part of a joint venture in Cambodia, and that joint venture provided some finance to an entity in Cambodia that was constructing a sugar mill. And there were some people who were displaced as a result of that process. And so they brought it directly to us. But there were a number of interested other parties, which is really, I suppose, it's what other NCPs would see as standard practice. Sometimes it's a very splintered group, whether it's the claimants or the people who are claiming to represent them. So that provides a bit of a challenge for us. I mean, there was a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings. There was some mediation involved. We weren't able to participate in that, but we arranged for a mediator to be on the ground. It was complex. These are never simple. They're really difficult. They're ones where it's a bit tricky when you're in a finance situation to try and establish how far do you go back in your supply chain. If there's been a harm, is the finance firm responsible for remedy, and if so, how much? What are the proportions involved? There's lots of complexity, and I don't want to oversimplify this for a second. But I mean, the interesting point with it all is all the way throughout our engagement, we were having the bank would reference back to its corporate documents and to say this is the way we conduct ourselves. The claimants were saying, well, there's a bit of a gap between what you're saying in your corporate documents and what's happening on the ground. And as it turned out, towards the end of last year, the bank CEO finally came out and said, well, if we had that opportunity, I don't think we'd go and do that again. So there was a bit of an acknowledgement that there were some problems.
So a very complex case about the bank investing in a company doing business in Cambodia, being involved in this sugar mill that comes with displacement of people, and then of course the question about compensation also for the loss of land, for other damages that they suffered from. I'm turning to Ghislaine. What would you do? I mean, if you were approached as a bank with a case like that, what kind of questions would you ask beforehand?
Of course, it's important to see what kind of due diligence did we do, where did we miss something. I think it's all about knowing and showing. You have to share what you did, of course, depending on the consent with the client, but the company is involved here as well. Yeah, how far do you go in the supply chain? It depends also on your leverage. And did we use our leverage? Did we try to increase our leverage to work towards a solution? That is sometimes, that means sometimes that you have to work together with other parties or engage with other parties to create leverage. So those would be some questions I would ask. Yeah. And then, of course, I think the NCP is a very important institution to provide mediation and to engage with the affected stakeholders. The role of, and with regard to the question of access to remedy, are we as a bank, did we contribute, or are we linked to the negative human rights impacts that has an impact on the access to remedy? Most often, banks are linked to an adverse impact via their business relationship, via their client relationship. That does not mean straight away that they have to provide access to remedy, but you should also, with regard to access to remedy, make sure that the affected stakeholders have an access to remedy, leverage that as well.
Yeah, so I'd add, certainly I'm supportive of all the things that you said. I mean, the issue of leverage and keeping the company engaged is where it gets really tricky. And to this bank's credit, it was engaged sort of consistently in the follow-up arrangements. They've attended a number of meetings and attempted to influence the company. Now, interestingly, the company decided at a particular point that it had had enough, and it paid out the loan and finished the relationship. So, which is not ideal, right? You want to keep people engaged as much as you can, and also subsequent to which I think this goes to a little bit about the point that some of the other panellists made in terms of the level playing field, that this particular bank has announced that it's pulling out of Cambodia. It's not the first example I've heard. So we still have some work to do to make this work, because that's not what you want. You don't want countries, developing countries, where you've got very challenging circumstances, very poor governance. You want to get our multinational corporations in there. You want them to bring their good processes in. You want them to be able to use leverage. Maybe we need to move away a little bit from the gold standard and say, well, if we've moved it, the cause forward a little bit, well, that's good. And so, and now, as I think in one of the previous sessions that I've participated in today, we've got a new governance advisory board in our national contact point, and it'll be interesting to see the nature of the conversations in those circumstances, because really it's in everyone's interest to have these companies stay engaged, use their leverage, improve the circumstances, but we don't want to chase them out. We don't want to try and shame them and have them just not want to have anything to do with it, because it's just pushed it right to the top of their risk profile.
Thank you. I'm turning to Namit also to hear your perspective. Obviously, it's not that simple. I mean, we started off on a very optimistic note, we're so close to the project, lots of impacts. Then we see, if you're operating in a challenging environment regarding governance, obviously business cannot compensate for weak governance. So what is your perception of a case like that?
Sure. Not commenting on this specific case, but in general, if you look at any of such conflicts or controversies in countries where the regulations or governance is not that strong, the challenge starts from the policy formulation. If there is engagement of stakeholders beyond the usual suspects, when the policies are being formulated, if you have representatives of communities, civil society, as part of consultation when you're designing these policies, a lot of the processes can be at least taken into consideration to make sure that if there are any specific risks, that can be highlighted at a very, very early stage, and not necessarily once you have gotten into a conversation with a company, looking at working with a company in financing a project. It's already too late in terms of identifying some of these risks. The other challenge is also the due diligence process, because in many cases, the agencies are hired by the banks to do the due diligence, and there is some bit of biasness when these agencies are doing a due diligence in terms of making sure that how do you come out of this regular compliance mindset? How do you make sure that the due diligence includes the most marginalized, includes women and others who don't necessarily come out in say, if a consultant is going out and speaking to communities, there are certain sections of the communities who are left behind. How do you ensure that in that due diligence process, whoever is conducting the due diligence extends itself to make sure that the voices of some of these people who are generally left behind are incorporated? I think those are some of the fundamental gaps that come across in most assessments and due diligence, which results in a situation like this. And also in many cases, at least from my experience, the information about a bank doing a due diligence or potentially funding a project comes at a stage when the decision has been taken. If there is transparency when the bank is considering investing and when doing a due diligence, I think that also is an important moment to engage other stakeholders and put information out in the public domain, that you avoid getting into a conflict situation like which was mentioned here.
Thank you. So again, due diligence is key. I'm turning for a final question to Patrick before we open for discussion. I mean, how do you make sure then in your due diligence process that you describe to us that the relevant people are being heard? And I'm thinking particularly of challenging situations like FPIC situations with relocations. How do you make sure you're talking to the right people?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. It's very challenging. Again, as Namit just said, I think there is the risk also that the consultant we hire, because banks have to rely on consultant, environmental social consultant, especially in project finance, because we are bankers, we are not specialists on environment and social question. Really, a critical part is really the choice of the consultant. You want to ensure that your consultant has a relevant experience. You don't buy a consultant name. You have to take an experienced consultant, and you want to double check on the list of the principles that are going to be committed to that project, that these people have the relevant experience. For example, if you know that you have displacement, you want a social specialist that have a similar experience, ideally in the same country. So in order to make sure that your consultant will reach to these people. Also, I think as banks, we can engage also with the government, but as you mentioned, there are cases where the government may not have the strongest standard in terms of environment and social aspects. So again, there is no guarantee. We try to do our best and to be as thorough as possible.
Thank you. That also means, of course, that you have to be aware of the relevant issues. Otherwise, you cannot choose the right consultant. If you're not aware that, you know, building this sugar mill in Cambodia or wherever comes with that delocation of people, and that there is such a thing as the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, you will not reach out to the competent consultants.
It is true that by asking a few questions, for example, you take these cases, I mean, if it's in a particular country, it's a particular operation, you know that there is, for example, displacement, you know you have to be extra careful, you have to go the extra mile. We had a case, however, that made the headlines in a developed country, not to mention the Dakota Access Pipeline, where we thought that the law was perfect and the FPIC was very good, which didn't turn to be the case. So that's the difficulty in doing project finance. I think we have to keep on trying. That's a lessons learned. Clearly, all the banks involved in that project have taken the lessons. And therefore, that's why there's currently a lot of discussion. We are preparing a new version of the Equator Principle, and FPIC, free and prior informed consent, is really taking a large part on that, because we realize that even in developed country, what we thought, which we thought the law was better than in developing country, it turned out not to be the case.
Thank you very much. So antennas are critical. And as we talked about this morning, partnership with civil society, with organizations in the region, on the ground, are absolutely essential to be aware of the pertinent issues. But with this, I would like to open the floor for discussion. If you could just introduce yourself before you take the floor, and also maybe make sure that you have a question. Please, gentlemen.
Yes, hi, thank you. My name is Sergio. I am a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank. And I was wondering, who audits this compliance of the principles? Because as far as I understand, the enforcing mechanism is not clear. Who could say these banks are fully compliant with these principles, not only in the beginning of the operation, in the due diligence, but also in the implementation stage, and also in the post-implementation stage? Because we have seen these unintended effects of the target population. So who could be liable for those effects? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had Barbara raising your hand.
Yes, hello. Hi, my name is Barbara Bielich, and I lead the Financial Sector and Responsible Business Conduct Project at the OECD. I had two questions. I mean, the first is we're focusing this panel on project finance, and it's because it's an area where banks generally have very developed processes, largely thanks to the Equator Principles, as Patrick mentioned, which were introduced in 2003. As Christine mentioned, we are currently also developing guidance for general corporate lending transactions, which due diligence processes have to date been, relatively undeveloped for, even though they represent the vast majority of banking transactions. one of the main challenges that we've dealt with in our group, as Patrick will know, is that in many jurisdictions, there's legislation around client confidentiality. So banks are not allowed to disclose even their relationship with a client at certain times. And that makes collaboration on due diligence as well as reporting on due diligence very challenging. I'm wondering, I think one of the strengths of the Equator Principles are that they call on banks to report on transactions that fall under their principles publicly, which then also allows for auditing. Maybe, Patrick, because you're on the steering board of the Equator Principles, but also anyone else that has some thoughts, when that instrument and that standard was introduced, how did you get over this client confidentiality issue, which seems to be sort of a central consideration for banking operations today? And how can we sort of move towards broader transparency in general corporate lending transactions? And then my second question arises from the comments that John made about how NZ Bank eventually pulled out of Cambodia. This is also another challenging issue we're seeing in the context of responsible business conduct for the banking sector. Banks will often take a de-risking approach to certain geographies or sectors if they're just deemed overly risky, which at times penalizes responsible operators that are in high-risk sectors where financing is really needed and could make a huge impact. So how can we get over that as well, ensure banks can engage with responsible operators in high-risk sectors to promote SDGs and responsible business conduct? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I take one more. I saw a hand. Yes, please, the lady.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sophia Arreyes, and I'm from Transparency International Cambodia. Mr. Birch mentioned sort of a difference between the gold standard and this is sort of built into banks pulling out of Cambodia because of the incident that happened. But I'm wondering, we worked quite a bit, or we try and work quite a bit with financial institutions in Cambodia. And I'm wondering if there is a consideration or a thought about translating, not necessarily translating, but making the policies that are developed in headquarters for issues like transparency, for issues like anti-corruption, human rights, environmental issues, and making them more digestible, understandable, and important on the ground. A lot of times I'll hear, we have this policy in headquarters, we're okay. But then when we delve into it, we find out that there's not really proper implementation, not really proper training. So I'm wondering if banks are thinking, if the financial institutions are thinking about how to translate that gap when you go from the headquarters to the ground. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Highly relevant, how to go beyond the brochure, essentially, and make it work on the ground. I would like to turn to the panelists for answers. I think, Patrick, I start with you because it was obvious, the question on the Equator Principles. You seem to have found a solution, huh?
I wouldn't say so, to be frank, because I think when you look at the reporting requirement that were that came out of the third version of the Equator Principle, and again, the fourth version is in the making, the disclosure requirement is very minimal. Basically, on which project the banks are working, we cannot even name the project because of our mention of client confidentiality. I think I'm more hopeful that we're going to be able to move forward on the basis that if the banks, who have adopted the Equator Principle are the vast majority of the lender in a particular project, then you can tell your client, you make it a requirement of the Equator Principle to say, you have to let me disclose the fact that I'm working on this project. And that's the problem that we are facing in corporate lending, where basically we don't have that way, because usually it's larger syndicate of banks with more different type of bank, so it's quite difficult to basically get the client to agree that we are able to disclose, because this is really a difficulty that we are facing, even if we are trying to do the right thing, is that confidentiality laws for banks do not allow you as a bank to say with whom you are working or not working. You have to specifically seek your client consent to be able to disclose anything about the financing you are working on with your clients. So that's quite a difficulty for banks when you try to be a bit more transparent.
Maybe I can.
Sure, please.
Yes, I agree with you. But we have examples that we asked explicitly for the consent of our client to disclose parts of our engagement. This was a case when there was, well, NGOs were really raising concerns. We were engaging with the company. We saw some progress. I think the company also wanted to share that as well. So it's a case-by-case approach, but we would seek consent of the client and try to use that path to disclose yeah, our engagement activities. And I think sometimes the client benefits from that as well.
So that essentially means under current regulation, without the consent of the client, it's not possible to fully disclose.
Correct. And in Asia, the banking guidelines, banking secrecy is very, very strong. So it's absolutely not possible.
That means we have another call on the regulator on the list.
Probably, I mean, in many cases, I think banks will be eager to show what we are doing or trying to do. And the client confidentiality for us is really a limitation. And I wanted to answer also one of the questions from a gentleman.
Can you wait a moment?
Sorry?
Can you wait a moment
Yes.
with that answer? I'll get to that in a second. But I would like to involve all the panelists in answering the questions, and I thought I would turn to Namit about the question, who actually audits the banks? Implementation. I'll give the banks a word.
Right, and then thanks, Sergio, for asking that question. And I think it's more about audit. It's about making sure that whatever is there in the policy and disclosures is actually being implemented. And whatever we have been talking about is largely based on disclosures, policies, and mechanisms. And as part of the work that I'm doing with Fair Finance Asia, we are looking at two aspects, and that also stresses upon the fact that civil society does have a role in making sure that the policies and the practices are sort of meeting, and there is not a very wide gap between the two. What we do as part of this regional program is identify banks, some of the top banks in these Asian countries, and look at the policy commitments and mechanisms that they have. And that's largely the policy assessments that we do and publish every year. With that, we also do practice assessments or case studies. So we identify certain sectors that are known to be more vulnerable and insensitive, and then look at what kind of projects and what kind of violations have been happening in those sectors, and which are the banks who have an exposure in those sectors. And with that, we try to make a point that just by having those policies and mechanisms is not enough. So far, we have found that there is a wide gap between what the policies and commitments say and what's happening on ground. We take that to the banks, the companies, and the regulators to kind of look at their respective roles in plugging that gap. But again, I mean, it's easier said than done. It's really also linked to the client confidentiality clause that is prevalent in most Asian countries. With that, the other challenge that comes is consortia funding. I mean, there might be a couple of banks coming together and funding a project. And that becomes even more difficult because a bank would say that we are just one of the 10 banks funding that project. So unless everybody aligns their policies and commitments together, it's really difficult to influence that process. So it's really is very, very complicated and complex. But yeah, I mean, as long as we have transparency in some of these dealings, the role of holding players accountable, including the banks, is a shared responsibility of civil society and others who have a role to play there.
Is it only the role of civil society?
No, so which is why I said civil society and others, and that also includes account holders who eventually, I mean, it's the money that as account holders we put in the bank. And if the bank is not following due diligence and risk mitigation practices, it is the account holder's money which is at risk. But again, I mean, there is not enough awareness, at least in Asia, of the role that me as an account holder and the influence that I would have as an account holder over the bank is very, very limited. So I think it's a broader role, but civil society is playing and needs to play a much more active role in that space.
Thank you. Patrick, you wanted to come in on that question also.
No, it was more on the other question from the gentleman about the audit in the Equator Principle. How banks are, is there a mechanism to audit? It is not part of the Equator Principle because banks are not playing auditors against each other because it's different. So it's something we know is an improvement that can be brought to the Equator Principle to find a way through external consultant to be able to audit the work that has been done.
I'm not sure if the question was also about making sure that all the participants comply with the rules. You know, what do you do if you come to the conclusion, well, maybe one bank is a bit problematic? Wasn't that the question?
No.
What do you do?
No, but usually I think even in corporate lending, you don't have that cases because you have certain, the banks, once the transaction has been signed, there is not too much different. There may be some certain voting, for example, if there is an amendment to the financing because, for example, there's a breach or the client is seeking a waiver, maybe there's a way for discussion, which is put to vote. And the vote, unfortunately, yes, it is linked to the share of the banks, and you have certain voting rights. You have to attain two-thirds majority, for example. So if you have banks that are blocking, obviously it's difficult, and I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, except that if we find that one of our fellow competitors is being too difficult or not realistic, next time we don't invite him to the next round of financing.
Yeah, I think the question was really about, because the Equator Principles also stand as a sort of quality certification if you're a member of the Equator Principles, and that of course raises the question, how can you make sure that the level is being maintained?
It is, I think, the way it works is because the Equator Principle refer to very specific standards, especially for the country with the IFC performance standard. It's very clear the rules to be followed on how you apply these principles. So I think in that respect, there's less ability for banks to take a differing view because these are the same underlying principles, and you get guidance from a third-party consultant that tells you this is the way they should be applied. So there's in that instances, it is easier for banks to have a more aligned position compared to corporate lending where there is very limited rules.
Okay, you wanted to come in on that, Gillian? No? Good. Then we have the question about divestment or walkout in difficult situations, that there is a tendency of banks to walk out and not to do business anymore, particularly in regions with weak governance. I'm turning to John. If you think about NCP procedures, do you see any options to prevent such a reaction?
You mean prevent
Prevent
the
in
banks
the
from just
sense
walking
of,
away?
you know, could you make suggestions during a mediation process, for example?
Oh, look, I'm sure we can. I think it's about just being a little bit creative with the way you want to think about some of these problems. I mean, often what you get with a particular problem is it's a manifestation of a generally awful situation on the ground. So it's complex. It's come about because of a whole lot of things that are going on, many of which are really out of the hands of any particular actor. So I think we can get creative. We can make a difference. I mean, the other thing is there's a bit of a flurry of mechanisms out here, and it's a bit hard for some firms just to keep up with it all. And so I think there's a bit of a role for governments where we drive these things to play a bit of an education role ourselves. I know in Australia we've signed up to a few things. One of them is this new Financial Sector Commission, which is a sort of a partnership with Liechtenstein, which is really about focusing on the role of the financial sector in modern slavery and human trafficking. But there are some overlaps, and it's part of our role should be to help explain some of these things and where they can work together to get a better outcome. Otherwise, it can get a bit splintered. just while I've got the microphone, I'll just pick up the comment from the person from Transparency International. And my apologies if I don't have enough time right now to give you what you're actually looking for, but I'll have a bit of a crack at it. It's about making policies more digestible on the ground, and I think she also asked whether I knew what the banks were thinking. I don't know what the banks are thinking. I do get a sense that they're getting an idea that there can't be a disconnect between head office policy and what they're doing in developing countries, because they're going to be made accountable for this. There was a comment earlier about outsourcing due diligence. Sometimes that just makes sense to have someone on the ground to do it. But when you get that due diligence advice back, what you do with that next is the big thing, right? Just paying for someone to do a report on it and saying it's someone else's problem, well, I don't know, what do the bank finance committees think about that? Presumably that's a key point where they're going to decide whether they commit or whether they walk away or whether they need to continue the discussion.
Thank you. I would like to turn to you about translating the policies so that they work on the ground.
Somebody told me once, laws, 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 they are all dead letters. It's about enforcement and implementation, and that's the same for policies as well. Of course, implementation is very important. Training of our first line, of our account managers who have the engagement with the clients who do the first assessment. Awareness sessions continuously. I mean, we are, situations develop, policies develop, and working together with third parties on implementation. So it is a continuous process. And how can you see what is the evidence of implementation? I think there the NGOs play indeed a very important role. And we also, we can't share client information, but we can share with NGOs our processes. What kind of tools do we use? How does our assessment look like? And we are a Dutch bank. A lot of NGOs are based in the Netherlands. We are used to engagement with NGOs. That's not always the case in this region. So in some cases, NGOs, we need the NGOs to do our due diligence properly because they have the people on the ground, they have the knowledge. So we see them as well as a partner in our due diligence as well.
Thank you very much. We'll have time for another round of questions. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Chung Lee. I'm from the CMSC of Vietnam, which is the Commission of Managing State Capital. I have two questions actually. I have one just, what are the advices regarding you guys can give in terms of solutions or method that state-owned enterprise can manage their finance better to comply with responsible business? And secondly, just an opinion-based question. If you have to advise $1 million project, what percentage of that $1 million would you advise the company to use to be responsible business? Thank you.
Can you just rephrase the second part of your question with the $1 million?
Let's just say that a company has to, to do a $1 million project. What would you advise that company to? What percentage of that $1 million would you advise that company to use to comply with the SDGs or be to be responsible?
Okay, thank you. I have the impression you want to come in right now.
I will try.
Very energetic.
Without safety net. I think it's very difficult to say in respect of your second question how much that would cost. I think if the state-owned company doesn't have I would say, very good environmental and social risk management processes in place, I think our advice would be that you get the service of an experienced consultant to help that state company to put in place this environmental and social risk framework in place in order for the project to be developed in a responsible manner. And then you will have, when the lenders will come in, they will review what is being proposed. They will have also their own consultant. And that way, when you have, with these two views, I think you can achieve a good result. And if you look at the mere cost of such consultant, is actually quite small. What's probably more costly is to put in place the appropriate corporate structure to address that, but I wouldn't think that it is enormously costly. And on top of that, it will reinforce the chance of everything going right, your project being delivered on time and within budget. So that's why it is hard to put a direct cost.
Maybe Namit, you could come in here. I feel slightly uncomfortable. I see all these armies of consultants now involved in these projects, and maybe Namit, you have a different view also?
Sure. So I think your second question, I think it's about 100% of the portfolio should be responsible, because, I mean, it's a huge risk to have even a small percentage of the portfolio that's not responsible. There is no business case for irresponsible business or irresponsible banking. So I think that's a short answer, but it obviously will not happen immediately. So it's about how do you time it out, how do you phase it, and what are the processes that a state-owned bank or financial institution is following. And I think having consultants or some of these processes is just the tactics, but it's important to have the top management, and including the board, to own and acknowledge the role of a financial institution in some of these issues. What is the influence, leverage, and role of a financial institution to make sure that projects are complying with human rights laws and environmental laws? So I think that is the starting point. Once you have that intent in place, how do you get going with that is just the tactics of it. So I think that's specifically more important when it's a state-owned company. And coming from India, I mean, there are a lot of state-owned financial institutions, and the biggest ones are owned by the state. And there is a clear role that they have in place. I mean, as compared to a private bank, they are certainly on a higher moral ground when it comes to making sure that they are complying with some of these environment and social and human rights issues. So I think, for me, that is most important. Where is the acknowledgement and intent coming from? And then the rest is tactics. How do you go about doing that?
Thank you. And this is actually where consultants can be extremely helpful if you have to convince top level management, whether it's in a state organization or in a private company. Do we have, you want to come in?
Yeah,
please?
I just want to briefly add that I think it's indeed very important that in the engagement, top-level management is included. If the CEOs have a conversation on this, it's really, yeah, that is how it should be.
Do we have more questions? Yes, please.
Hi there, my name is Sophia Nazalia. I work for Varus Maplecroft. We're a data analytics and risk advisory firm. I wanted to know what the panel's thoughts were on the trend of mandatory reporting or ESG reporting within Asian stock exchange regulations. So, you know, we see more and more, you know, the major stock exchanges in Asia having some form of mandatory ESG reporting. I mean, the quality of reporting is questionable, but, you know, I'd like to know what your thoughts were on that. Would that impact the ESG landscape in the next few years? And, yeah, in general, what your thoughts were.
Thank you very much. Very important question, especially when we talk about the Thai stock exchange. Very strong trend to require mandatory reporting. I'll go through the panel, starting with Patrick.
Yes, I think my first reaction, I don't know exactly in each country the type of ESG requirement that the stock exchange are putting in place, but I think we view it very positively in the sense that in order to be able to report on ESG, you have to measure. And to measure, you have to put the organization in place. So that is putting a lot of incentive to our client to address properly their ESG issues. So in reply to your question, yes, it is absolutely positive.
So I think it's a positive trend, but it's too early to celebrate. And like you yourself said, the quality of those disclosures and reporting is still not that good. So it's a first step in that direction. My experience has been the quality of disclosures across these countries has not been really good. So unless, I mean, there are disincentives for companies listed on these stock exchanges who are either, disclosing bad quality of reporting or, saying something but doing something else, it's not really very, very useful. So good first step in transparency, but, it's still far away from anybody, being able to use that information to hold these companies accountable.
Of course, the quality of reporting is very important, and we see a development as well that some of the stock exchanges also look into the quality of the reporting. So I think that's a very good development. And I agree with Patrick, if you have to start reporting, well, you need to measure and you have to have your organization in place, and it starts the process of thinking about sustainability risk management or your goals, your KPIs. You will include KPIs in your reporting, and the next report you have to report on those KPIs. Did you meet those KPIs? So I think reporting is a very good step, and as well in this region transparency is also sometimes quite challenging, so it will also improve further transparency. And our conversations, start of conversation, our engagement with companies, it can also be a starting point in that way.
Thanks. I think that was a really good question. Thanks for asking it. I absolutely agree with everyone. I just think it's a great thing in these markets that we've got people engaged who care about this stuff. I know we saw Dr. Seri in the ACHA forum. He was an eloquent champion for driving these mechanisms. I don't think we could be too picky in terms of who's engaging with them, and it's early days, but it's a good start. I mean, what we're seeing in countries like Australia is that it's all a bit, it has been in the past sort of a bit trendy to have a corporate responsibility statement up on your website, and that's a good start, but now we're seeing that you can't just have it there, you have to walk the talk. And so if this is a start for a similar process to take place in this region, I'm completely supportive of it, because if it helps us start that journey down the pathway to a point where they absolutely taking it seriously and it's front of mind, then I think it's been a good thing.
So it's a first step to link the regulator with the debate that we're having with banks and civil society. Margaret, did you have a question?
Yes, Margaret. Sorry, Margaret Walkenfeld, Themis Research. One of the things that we're seeing, excuse me, in this region, but of course in other regions, particularly around the SDGs, is the push for more infrastructure financing. And a push as well to make infrastructure as itself an asset class, which brings its own challenges. We probably won't go into those, but thinking particularly about infrastructure financing in this region, we may well see syndications with different types of banks from different types of countries with different types of standards. And perhaps the panel would like to address, particularly if you're an Equator Principal Bank in a broader syndication, how you start to address that in this region, or how we start to think about responsibility in infrastructure financing, perhaps in something like BRI projects where you may have no Equator banks in there. How do we start to address this issue? I think it's interesting, if anybody saw it over the weekend, the G20 has developed a set of principles on quality infrastructure that are very interesting talk about environmental and social issues. And I think as just a lead-in to this question, that would be one way of starting to get governments to incorporate those requirements into their own concession contracts. But I'd be curious to hear as to what we are seeing from governments in this region, if anything at all about environmental and social requirements is a core part of infrastructure financing, or whether that has to come entirely from outside, from the financiers or the development finance institutions as well. And I think just building on the other question that we just had, I think indeed, how do we get more interest from the regulators in this region, building on indeed the good examples from the stock exchanges? Are they picking up lessons learned, for example, from the European region, where you really are seeing a very strong push on incorporating environmental and social and governance issues into the regulatory fabric? I don't know. I haven't heard any examples, so it would be interesting, particularly if any of you have examples from countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For a change, I turn to you first.
Well, I would like to underline that implementing applying the Equator principles, it's a part of risk management. It's better. You're managing your environmental and social risks better. And I think a lot of financial institutions in this region also realize that. Signing up for the EP, maybe not, but I believe it's not often such a huge discussion if there are non-EP banks to apply the EP. But I think Patrick can give a better answer to that because he has a lot of experience than I have. I'm more experienced in corporate lending. But I was at a conference last week, UNESCAP in China, and this point was also raised. China has only one EP bank, but in practice, a lot of Chinese banks apply the EP, especially when there are EP banks involved. Yeah.
The infrastructure, maybe?
That was a question on infrastructure, I think.
Patrick?
Yes, no, I can confirm that in a syndicate of banks, if you apply the Equator principle, you don't have to have all the banks applying the Equator principle. If only a few banks have as an absolute requirement, which would be the case for ourselves, otherwise we couldn't finance a project to apply the Equator principle, I think we are able to convince the other banks to let us apply the Equator principle, to follow basically the procedure of the Equator principle, to analyze and basically mitigate the environmental and social risk. So in that case, yes, it will apply. Now, I'm not very familiar with this new G20 principle. I will have a look at them, but clearly, if they're of interest, I think, yes, bank could consider incorporating them also as a requirement. Now, talking about our regulators, for me, it is difficult to speak on their behalf.
So I think when you talk about infrastructure in this region, these are all mega infrastructure projects. And the other added complexity is that these are all government projects. So what is the leverage of financial institutions and others to influence or hold government mega infrastructure projects accountable? And it's also linked to, I think in the morning in one of the panels, there was a remark on this race to the bottom and this competition between nations in the region. And surprisingly, in most of these mega projects, you'll find n number of environment activists, NGOs, human rights defenders coming out with reports at how these projects are going to harm people, communities, and the environment. Despite all of those, the projects are still going on. This really, shows how some of these voluntary guidelines or principles are really ineffective when it comes to such huge projects. It's also about what is the leverage of a few banks or financial institutions to bring in that level of accountability. It's also about how you make sure that the activists and the human rights defenders who are coming out in the open and saying what are the problems or the violations or potential violations with these projects, they are seen as troublemakers, and there are actions taken against some of them by several governments. So what is the role of multilateral organizations to come and stand in support of some of those activists? Because I mean, when it comes to national governments, it's really, really difficult, and I don't think some of these voluntary principles and guidelines will be effective to hold some of these mega infrastructure projects and governments accountable. So we need something much more powerful than that, and definitely something that supports human rights defenders and environment activists.
Yeah, there's so many places you could go with this, really, isn't there? I mean, it's a great question. How do you think about well, one of them anyway, how do you think about the challenges when you're in a financing sort of club arrangement? It's a question for the banks to answer, I guess. I assume they're already weighing up these considerations carefully, because as we know, has been stated elsewhere, the reputational implications are just rapid, and so they're looking at it. Look, awareness of the issues is going to increase, and the Europeans and others see this region as a really good opportunity for growth, so they're going to have to tackle these issues and try and work a way forward. But they're going to have to probably take, I would expect, a role in leading and modelling what good behaviour is about, and hopefully it'll get some momentum.
Thank you very much. Do we have one last urgent question? Please.
Hi, thanks so much. Sarah Blackwell from the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. A few initiatives that are quite promising and progressive were mentioned, including the Dutch Covenant process for the banking sector, as well as the Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery, groups that are really engaging with the responsibility to respect human rights for the sector as a whole, particularly around the role of remedy, going beyond just the use of leverage. And recognizing all that, and some of the folks we have on the panel who are, or I would say, more mature in this sector, wanting to also point out that some banks are very not as mature and are perhaps more hesitant. So I'm thinking of the Thun Group and the paper they put out a few years ago, self-defining the scope of responsibility for the financial sector, and the quite loud criticism and pushback that that original paper got from not only civil society, but Professor John Ruggie, the author of the Guiding Principles. There's been revisions since then and a lot of interesting discussion, but just wanting to recognize some of the laggards in the sector and ask you all, from where you sit, how can we bring those more reluctant peers in the sector along? Thank you.
Very important question. I think that affects all panelists. Patrick, can we start with you? How to bring in the ones that are lagging behind?
It's a difficult question because I think we are not there to manage our competitors. I think if we are able to demonstrate for those banks who take the higher standard that we basically have a less risky business and we are less challenged, I think our competitors will probably see the benefit of being more rigorous in their ESG approach. That's the best advice I would make. Noting that we can always progress ourselves.
I think if you want to level the playing field, I mean, it's in your own interest to bring them on board, right?
Yes, we can try to convince them, but we cannot force them. That's the point.
True. Then we're back to the regulator. Namit?
Yeah, difficult question. I mean, knowing and showing is definitely something that, some of us are already doing, but it's not that effective. Even though we know that, there are risks, long-term risks for banks not being transparent and responsible, they continue to do that. Unless the overall narrative that defines success in the banking sector changes, unless the sector itself evolves from being short-term, looking into long-term risks and opportunities, this is not going to change. But I'm afraid I don't have an answer how to do that.
Ghislaine, do you think maybe if we have once the OECD guidance on project finance, could that instrument play a role in bringing the laggards on board?
Definitely could it play a role, creating a level playing field is also something that we continuously work on, not only on human rights but broader on the sustainability risk management. So in this region, we organize roundtables for local banks to share our experiences. And to just how do our policies look like? What kind of tools do we use? We really want to share. It's not a competitive angle, we also published a guide on what did we do to implement the UN guiding principles. It's not a finished story. We are ongoing. It's an ongoing process. We also have to work on our reporting, on improving our due diligence continuously. So this is how we try to bring other banks on board.
Thank you. Finally, John, what role for the NCPs? I mean, assuming that if there are so many banks lagging behind, and if we see the number of cases that we have concerning the financial sector, I would assume that some of these banks will end up with an NCP at some stage.
Yeah, well, look, as an NCP, I've already put my colleague's details in my phone, and I'll be following up with her to see if she can come down to Australia at the next opportunity and have a discussion with us. So really it's about sharing good practice and I guess demonstrating that this thing can be done and can be actually, very beneficial, a strong net benefit if you get these aspects right. I think some people mentioned in the HA thing about trying to take a longer view on costs and benefits in terms of a cost-benefit analysis and understanding that these costs may actually well end up being a very sensible, very wise upfront investment for a longer-term benefit.
Thank you. I mean, that's convincing that you try to bring across the argument, but isn't there a stronger possibility also? I mean, if you have a case being filed arguing that Bank A does not comply with the guidelines, can't you do more than just, advise?
What, you mean shame them amongst their peers?
No, I'm just asking, what can be the role of the NCP in also making clear what is the standard? What do we mean? And we're talking about real work implementation here.
Well, I think as I mentioned earlier on, this can be a bit confusing as well, but particularly for smaller enterprises to know what is it that they can actually do. There's a lot of actions going on and probably we can play a bit of a role in trying to help walk them through the various things that are around and help them better understand. I think there's a role for government to do that. We're asking business to go in and, in a sense, in some aspects, do a bit of a government role in helping to bring about, say, change and reform in developing countries. So I think there's a responsibility for government to say, well, what can we do to help them to be better, not just sort of standing on the sidelines and being critical about them.
Thank you. Maybe this just triggers a question to Namit. What would you expect from NCPs? And again, we're talking about Sarah's examples, banks really being far behind all the others.
Right. I think, linking this back to the question on reputation, and if there are such cases, and if NCP takes a real strong position on, why a bank came into this sort of a situation, it really, strengthens the ability of civil society organizations to kind of use that information and go back to regulators and banks and say that, this is how a situation can go wrong, and this is what banks need to do and regulators need to do. Because oftentimes what happens is if civil society is talking about expectations from the banks, unless, there is hard evidence coming from other institutions and organizations, it's very difficult to get banks to seriously engage on those conversations. So if NCPs take a stronger view on some of these situations, it will really strengthen civil society's ability to be able to push the envelope further and have those conversations with key stakeholders.
I think we can take one very last question and then we need short answers. Please.
Madeline Bridget from the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. I'm the co-chair for the Business and Human Rights Subcommittee. I would like to know the views of the panel on the issue about whether you think that some of the difficulties with the due diligence process has to do with who is actually conducting that due diligence and how much that person or organisation knows about human rights and international human rights laws and the ability to actually identify what a human rights violation may look like.
Thank you. I think we touched upon these issues before. Namit, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so just adding on. So I think the issue is not necessarily about the knowledge and understanding of the consultants themselves, but it's also about the scope of the work or the terms of the reference. It largely, in the cases that I am aware of, it's largely about helping the person who's commissioned the due diligence. And if any consultant comes back with a large number of risks and is making the life of the commissioning manager difficult, there are chances that the consultant will not get the second contract of due diligence. So there is also this conflict of interest between consultants who conduct due diligence to make sure that you are not making things very, very difficult. How do you handle this is obviously very, very difficult. But yeah, I mean, some of the cases that I've come across, that's majorly the problem. Even if they know that there are issues with the project, they will not go that extra mile to identify those risks and flag those risks.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to conclude at this stage. I'm looking at the clock and I know that some of you will have to catch the bus to be bussed to the Swedish delegation. I would nevertheless, before we thank the panelists for their contributions, try to come up with a few takeaways, at least from my perspective. I've noted down 5. I think we all agreed that leveling the playing field is absolutely essential. We all agreed in a second point that there are standards out there. It's not necessarily a need for new standards. We have the OECD guidelines, we have the UNGPs, we have the guidances, the specific ones for the financial sector. But what's really lacking is connecting these standards with the regulator, because the regulator, obviously, in financial industry is absolutely crucial. And this is my third point, the call on the regulator to take action. We talked about confidentiality, where there is a real lack of regulation. We saw that the mandatory reporting requirements that are being introduced in the region by several stock exchanges are welcomed, although, of course, implementation remains to be seen, but at least we have that missing connection now between standards and regulation. My fourth point, I think it's an obvious one. All of you talked a lot about reaching out to civil society, reaching out to stakeholders. Partnership was a key word, so engaging with stakeholders on a regular basis is crucial and is part, essentially, of due diligence. And that brings me to my 5th point, which is the role of national contact points. The word creative was used several times. NCPs are in a unique position because they have the people, they have the parties at the table. Once they get active, a bank has already agreed to be at least part of the process. So this is a really unique opportunity. We discussed that this could be a forum to try to convince a bank not to walk out of a difficult region, come up with solutions. Engagement was a very important term. We heard in the very beginning of this panel from Ghislaine how important it is that she will engage, or her bank will engage with companies if there is a difficulty on the ground, if there is a problem on the ground. And NCPs could use that technique and come up with solutions. But NCPs can also play a very important role in making clear what is required for implementing the different standards and guidelines that we have in the OECD context. Now with this, I would like to thank all the panelists. I think it was a very substantial discussion that we have. I would also like to thank you for the very interesting and thought-provoking questions. Let's finish with a round of applause for our speakers.